Hi, I'm Dan McCoy, and welcome to the factory. Today, we're going to make caramel popcorn, which is one of my favorite things. You might not think that comes from a chocolate factory, but it does. And we sometimes coat it in chocolate, but we sometimes just enjoy eating it like it is. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the way we approach things here. Whenever we want to start making something new, and particularly when we might not necessarily know what we're doing, we approach it like a project. So we start to sketch out all the elements that we like in a product and all the things that we don't. And we chart them out, and then we craft a journey that will take us to something that might be a different level than what we've had before. So kind of give you a really good example. If we go down the path of a caramel popcorn, we're going to all have memories and ideas about what we've had in the past. I mean, some of that could have been growing up with your grandmother and having a popcorn ball that you might have at Halloween, where the popcorn is cooked in a corn syrup, so it's a white color. It's usually kind of compacted into a ball, and it sticks together. And when I was growing up, they would wrap them often in plastic wrap, and they'd hand them out at trick or treat. I don't think anybody really allows you to do that anymore, because I think things need to be in a regular professional package. But that kind of flavor was very simple. It didn't have a lot of flavor from the sugar, if you will. You mostly just tasted sweetness along with the popcorn. And of course, everybody's familiar with Cracker Jacks. Well, Cracker Jacks is probably the most familiar caramel popcorn out there. Everybody wanted the prize. It was in the box. Had a pretty dark color, and it also had peanuts in it. It was delicious when you were growing up. You don't see it as much anymore, but still, it was a really good example of caramel popcorn. So when we set out to do this project, we knew that we wanted to have caramel popcorn that met a lot of those familiar elements, but at the same time, really intensified the flavor and also intensified the characteristics that we liked in a caramel popcorn. So show you a little bit about what we've created here. And we hand it out as samples at the factory, and we munch on it when nobody's looking. But this is an example of our caramel popcorn. And you'll notice that there's still a few little big chunks in there, but for the most part, these pieces are individual. They're fully covered in caramel. And one of the things that's really characteristic here is the type of popcorn that we use. And I'm going to talk to you about that in just a minute, but you can see that this mushroom popcorn basically has a rounded surface on the outside, which allows the caramel to coat the entire pieces of the popcorn. In a minute, I'll kind of show you why we think that's necessary. And in fact, let's go to the whiteboard. You know, I'm a consultant, so let's go to the whiteboard and let me show you a little bit about how we went through the thought process of creating our caramel popcorn. Okay, so we're back at the whiteboard, and I'm going to talk you through how we did our caramel popcorn project. So the first thing we had to decide was, okay, which popcorn are we going to use? Now, there's two big types of popcorn, and I'm going to be the first to tell you, I'm not a popcorn expert, but I am going to tell you that most of the popcorn that you've had in your life, particularly the kind you have at the movie theater or that you get out of the popcorn bag for your microphone, it's this butterfly or snowflake popcorn. The idea that it has this sort of snowflake look, or maybe in a weird Jackson Pollock way, it looks a little bit like a butterfly. But the other type of popcorn is mushroom, which means it has a big, smooth, round cap like a mushroom. Now, the snowflake popcorn is awesome for holding on to powders. So if you're going to put cheese powder on it or even salt, right, it's going to trap that in these little crevices, and it's going to carry that flavor through to your final product. But that's not what we want when we're making a caramel popcorn, because the idea of getting caramel in all of these little bitty individual ridges and grooves, it would just be frankly a nightmare to try to pull that off. So the mushroom popcorn we knew we needed, because it would allow us to coat this kind of round surface here with the caramel and make it uniform a lot easier than it would be if we were trying to use this snowflake or this butterfly approach. So the second thing we wanted to do with caramel popcorn is have incredibly good flavor. Now, that popcorn ball we had growing up, there were some good things about it. For instance, one, it tasted smooth, and if you tasted it, it maybe had the texture of a Jolly Rancher because it wasn't grainy, but it was also pretty hard on the outside. The second thing is, and it didn't have a lot of flavor. And Cracker Jacks, on the other hand, is pretty intense. It's pretty dark. It's got lots of flavor. But we thought it maybe had a little bit too much. So we wanted to find some place in the middle where we had that good, rich flavor of a great caramel style popcorn. But at the same time, it didn't compete with everything else that was going on. It didn't just blow out the other flavors that you might have, like the flavor of popcorn itself, or as we're going to learn later, some additions that we might want to add. So we knew that we wanted to have a strong caramel, but just moderately strong. So the flavor profile that we are pretty familiar with here in our factory is of traditional caramel, toffee, and of course what Grandma brought. We love caramel. We make stand-up caramels. We make caramels for pecan clusters. We make caramel for candy bars. We love the flavor of caramel. That Maillard style reaction of cooking milk and those proteins for a long period of time, it's just delicious, frankly. But we also like the rich, deeper flavors that we have in our toffee that we make here. Toffee often is known for that kind of deeper, richer molasses kind of character that you find. So we wanted a blend of these three things. So to get those things brought together, we knew that to get a traditional caramelization that we needed sugar. We also felt like we needed a little butter brought into the process. Butter brings the flavor of butter, but it also brings milk solids and proteins into the play, which often helps in that browning reaction and gives us that distinct flavor of a caramel. So we thought just plain sugar and butter would probably help us achieve the caramel part of it. We wanted that molasses character, and not a huge amount of it, but we wanted some of it. And we thought we could get that through brown sugar. I mean, brown sugar is a highly processed ingredient that's really processed white sugar that they go back and add molasses to. So we knew we could get the molasses from the brown sugar. And then finally, what made Grandma's popcorn balls have that clear shell, if you will, that was just coated each individual piece of popcorn? And it was glucose. Now, she probably used Karo syrup or corn syrup, and in corn syrup is a big way of carrying a glucose. We actually use confectioner's corn syrup here, which is similar but a lot more dense. And that we thought with those three ingredients, the sugar, the brown sugar, and the glucose, we could get this flavor profile of kind of a blend between Grandma toffee and caramel. Now, the next thing we had to tackle was the texture. Now, if you just make a plain caramel, which we do here when we make our nut butters, we make a product that's called almost burnt caramel, meaning that we take sugar, we take water, and we cook it until it's almost burnt. We don't want to burn it, but we want to get really, really close. Because the longer you cook a caramel, the more amazing the flavor compounds start to be within that process. And so we knew that we wanted those intense caramel flavors present. But the problem with that caramel that we make for the nut butters and the gianduillas that we use for gianduillas is that it's very, very, very hard. And we make big sheets of it, and if you drop them on the table, they just shatter into a million pieces. It's that shattering effect. So we knew that if somebody bit into a piece of caramel popcorn, we didn't want it to be so hard that it would break a tooth. And at the same time, we didn't want it to shatter around the popcorn. We wanted it to be crunchy. So we really, even though it's kind of a hard shell, we wanted it to be softer and have this sort of crunchy character. So one of the tricks of the trade when you're making candy, that when you want to soften something, particularly like a caramel or brittle, you add a leavening agent. And the leavening agent that we usually add is baking soda. Now, baking soda reacts with the acidity that's present within the ingredients. It generates carbon dioxide. It foams up. Foaming leaves microscopic areas of gas that's trapped in almost the molecular level. of the caramel. And as it hardens, those gas bubbles get trapped. And as they get trapped and you bite into them, they become crunchy. So we thought through using this sort of leavening agent, we could get this soft, crunchy texture that we wanted on the outside of the popcorn. Finally, we wanted to talk about presentation. Like, how did it look? When I started making caramel popcorn almost 20 years ago, I actually made it and I poured it on the table and I just flattened it out into big sheets. Now, I would take chocolate and string it over the top and break it into big pieces and chunks and put it into popcorn containers and wrap it in cellophane, and it looked amazing and it tasted good. But they were like kind of a rice cake approach to making caramel popcorn, and we just knew we really didn't want to do that. We wanted to have individual pieces. But we're a chocolate factory and we don't have like a huge caramel popcorn machine. So when we make it, we're gonna have to make it using the existing equipment we have and then be able to try to pull off the presentation that we want. So there were a couple things. We wanted these individual pieces and they thought, well, there's two things we can do. One, purely mechanical. So before the caramel hardens completely and sticks them all together into these big sheets or big shards, we could actually separate them. So we could mechanically separate them. And that's a great idea, but there's a problem. And the problem is as soon as you start to mix that popcorn, which is probably at room temperature, with a caramel, which is about 295 or 300 degrees, it's going to start to cool. And as that cooling process occurs, it's going to harden and it's going to stick together. So you're going to have a limited amount of time. I often tell people that making candy is often sitting around a long time watching a kettle boil, and then about 7 minutes of sheer terror as you try to create it before you get a chance to lose that opportunity to manipulate it when it's in that great zone. And so that's kind of the challenge here. So we thought mechanical is one point. We could certainly get some work with our hands. But finally, we could introduce maybe some chemicals to help us out. And the chemical we thought we would use is lecithin. Now, lecithin, if you Google it, you're going to find a lot of stuff about lecithin, but it's found in egg yolks. It's used to make mayonnaise. It's a glycolipid that helps to emulsify things. So think oil and water. It helps to bring them together to make an emulsification like a salad dressing or even a mayonnaise. But it has one other kind of characteristic, and that is it prevents things not just at a molecular level that are real sticky from sticking together, but it can do it at a macro level too. And so if we take a little bit of lecithin and we mixed it with some canola oil so that we can spread it around a little bit easier and only use a small amount of lecithin but have a bigger product to work with, we knew that if we could get that popcorn coated just a little light film of this lecithin oil mixture, it would separate a lot easier. So we decided to use a combination of mechanical and kind of chemical ways to introduce an approach to separating out the caramel corn. And that's what we did. So that, for the most part, that's going to get you caramel corn. Now, we want to make it a little bit fun. And the way to get it fun is to add a couple more kind of accessories, if you will, to the caramel popcorn. The first one is obvious, right? That's nuts. Nuts are an amazing textural change that's present. They bring a lot of flavor. It's something different than just to say, biting into popcorn. If you get a peanut, it's often adds a lot of fun, if you will, to eating that product. So the nuts, we wanted to be able to not just add them at the end, because there's a lot of problems with doing that too, right? They're cold, and if you add them at the end, even if they're roasted and caramelized to the right temperature, you're going to end up with not a very uniform distribution. So we wanted to be able to cook these nuts along with the caramel. So the challenge we have is that these nuts cook at a lot of different rates. They're depending on size, etc. So this was a lot of trial and error to find nuts that were the right size and the right time in this process to introduce them, so that when we finished the project at around 295 to 305 degrees, that the nuts were completely cooked and roasted, but not overcooked or burned. So things like peanuts, for instance, we found that half peanuts actually were a great way to go because they take a long time often to cook. And so introducing them by smaller pieces that are halves, we could cook them faster, but we still had to introduce those first. Cashews were much the same way. We found that getting half cashews worked out a lot better. But pecans were different because pecans cook a lot faster. And we're in an area of the world where we have amazing pecans, and we're able to get smaller Texas native hardshell pecans, so they're not very large. And so we could actually keep the pecans whole, but add them much later in the process, so that by the time we finished with the caramel popcorn, we've got all the caramel done, the nuts, the peanuts, and the cashews done, but we could have whole pecans, which added a huge amount of look to the presentation. And then also, we're in the hill country of Texas, and we like spices here. And I've always made a spicy caramel popcorn, so it made sense for us to do a version of that here too. But spices are different. We would not want to add the spices early on because they would burn and lose their flavors, and they would change in the character of the spice that we're going for if we did that too early. So we just wanted to bloom them at the end. So we incorporate the spices when we add the baking soda at the end, and that way they bloom. We can then incorporate in the popcorn, and we still get that aroma and freshness of the spices right when we finish the project. Now, if you were to walk in the factory the day we're making our spicy popcorn, you're going to smell these beautiful spices because that caramel and the blooming action that occurs, it's just frankly amazing. So that's our approach to caramel popcorn. That's exactly how we do it. Those are the ingredients that we use, and the way we do it's pretty simple. We add the sugar, the brown sugar, the glucose. We wait just a little bit on the butter. We put it in our big copper kettle with just a little bit of water, and we hand stir it with a wood paddle. And as it starts to cook and it starts to get a little hotter, starts to boil, we start to see a little bit of action maybe over the boiling point, we'll incorporate the butter. We incorporate it pretty slowly, and we continue to cook it and cook it and cook it until we get to about 295 to 305 degrees. At that point, we add the baking soda and we add our spices, if that's what we're going to add. And we stir it in and we let it foam up so that we can incorporate and produce the gas that's present there. At that point, we pour it into a big, huge stainless steel kettle that's full of pre-cooked popcorn, and we stir it around slowly as we're adding it in. It finally gets so much of a mass that we actually have to use our hands to toss it around. So we have gloves that we sanitize and then we reuse, but we use these gloves to toss this extremely hot caramel popcorn mixture. When it starts to get pretty well tossed, we'll incorporate the lecithin and the oil, which will again give us some separation. It takes it from being sticky to not as sticky. We'll toss it a little bit more, and then we'll pour it onto our big white table, and as many of us that are in the factory will start to work on it, and we'll start to separate it out, first into big flat sheets, and then into individual pieces of popcorn. And you know what? That's how we make our caramel popcorn here at Hill Country Chocolate.